The whistle of the train pierced the autumn air as it pulled into Humboldt Station, Nevada, in the year 1878. Ruby Calloway clutched her well-worn carpetbag, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped onto the wooden platform. The journey from Boston had been long and arduous, but it was nothing compared to the anxiety of what lay ahead. She scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face, though she knew there would be none. The cousin who had promised to meet her was nowhere to be seen. Ruby pulled her shawl tighter around her ample frame, acutely aware of the stares from the other passengers as they were greeted by their loved ones. Her full figure had always drawn attention, sometimes admiring, often judgmental. In Boston, her curves had been considered unseemly for a woman of respectable society. Out here in Nevada territory, she hoped things might be different. As the platform slowly emptied, Ruby's hope dimmed. The station master approached, sympathy evident in his weathered face. "Miss, is there someone meeting you?" he asked, glancing at the now deserted platform. "My cousin, Elizabeth Wilson," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite her growing concern. "She lives in Humboldt. Perhaps she's been delayed." The station master shook his head. "Miss Wilson, I'm afraid to tell you, she left town nearly 3 months ago, married a miner and moved to California." Ruby felt her carefully constructed plans crumbling. She had sold everything to come west, to help her cousin with her dressmaking business, to start anew after her parents' deaths had left her alone and without prospects in Boston. "I see," she managed, blinking back tears. "Is there a boarding house nearby where I might stay?" Before the station master could answer, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Pardon me, madam." Ruby turned to find herself facing a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothing faded denim pants, a chambray shirt, and a well-worn leather vest marked him as a working man, likely a rancher or cowboy. Despite his rough appearance, there was something gentle in his gaze. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark blonde hair. "I'm Dillon Forrester. I have a wagon outside if you need assistance getting to town." Ruby hesitated, years of proper Boston upbringing warning her against accepting help from strange men, yet something in his steady gaze put her at ease. "That's very kind, Mr. Forrester, but I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition, Miss Calloway, Ruby Calloway." "Miss Calloway," he repeated, offering a slight bow that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I'm heading into town anyway. Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable boarding house just off Main Street. I'd be happy to take you there." The station master nodded approvingly. "Dillon here is good folk, miss. His family's ranch, the Double F, is one of the oldest in the territory. You'd be in safe hands." Ruby glanced at her heavy trunk and then back at Dillon Forrester's extended hand. The alternative was to remain alone at the station as darkness approached. With a deep breath, she made her decision. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester. I would be most grateful for your assistance." As they walked toward his wagon, Ruby couldn't help but notice how he slowed his long strides to match her pace, how he carried her trunk with ease, and how his eyes never lingered inappropriately on her figure as so many men's did. Instead, he treated her with a respect she hadn't often experienced. "You've come a long way," Dillon observed as he helped her onto the wagon seat. "Boston, was it?" Ruby nodded, surprised he'd been paying such close attention. "Yes. I came to join my cousin, but it seems my information was outdated." Dillon clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. "That's a difficult situation to find yourself in. Do you have other family out west?" "No," Ruby admitted. "It's just me now." As the wagon pulled away from the station, Ruby cast one last glance back at the platform where no one had come to claim her. She didn't notice the way Dillon Forrester's eyes lingered on her face, or how his hands tightened on the reins as he made a silent promise to himself to ensure she found her place in Humboldt. The wagon jostled along the rutted road leading into town, each bump and dip causing Ruby to shift in her seat. Dillon noticed her discomfort and slowed the horses to a more gentle pace. "Not used to Western transportation, I take it?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ruby returned his smile tentatively. "In Boston, I rarely had cause to ride in anything more rustic than a hansom cab. And what brings a Boston lady all the way to Humboldt, Nevada?" His tone was conversational, not prying. Ruby hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My cousin wrote that she needed help with her dressmaking business. After my parents passed last winter, there was little keeping me in Boston." She didn't mention the mountain of debts her father had left behind, or how the family home had been sold to pay creditors, or how her prospects for marriage had dwindled as potential suitors discovered her lack of dowry. She especially didn't mention how her more slender friends had found husbands while she remained alone, hearing whispers about her unfortunate figure behind fans at social gatherings. "I'm sorry about your parents," Dillon said quietly. "Losing family is never easy." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with loss. Ruby studied his profile as he guided the horse's strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that seemed to hold both strength and sadness. "You have family in Humboldt?" she asked. "My father and younger brother," he replied. "We run the Double F Ranch together. My mother passed when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Ruby offered sincerely. He nodded in acknowledgement. "Life out here can be hard, but there's beauty in it too." He gestured toward the horizon where mountains rose against the deepening blue of the evening sky. "There's freedom here that you won't find back east." Ruby followed his gaze, taking in the vast landscape. It was so different from the crowded streets of Boston, intimidating in its openness, yet somehow inviting. As they crested a small rise, Humboldt came into view. It was smaller than Ruby had imagined, but more established than she'd feared. A proper main street lined with wooden buildings, some even boasting glass windows rather than oiled paper. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and lamplight already glowed in several windows. "It's not Boston," Dillon said, noting her examination, "but it's growing. We've got a school, 3 saloons, a bank, and even a proper doctor now." "And apparently no dressmaker if my cousin has left," Ruby murmured, more to herself than to Dillon. He glanced at her with interest. "You're a dressmaker?" "Yes, I've been sewing since I was a child. I worked with one of Boston's finest modistes for several years." "Is that so?" Dillon's expression brightened. "Mrs. Holloway was just saying last Sunday that the town needs a good dressmaker, since Mrs. Peterson died last spring. The women have been ordering from catalogs or making do with their old dresses." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest. "Do you think there might be an opportunity for me here?" "I'd bet on it," Dillon replied confidently. "The town's growing, and there are enough ranch wives and merchants' daughters who'd pay good money for fashionable dresses." As they approached the town proper, Ruby straightened her back and adjusted her hat. First impressions mattered, especially for a woman alone in a new town. She was grateful for Dillon's kindness, but knew she couldn't rely on the help of a stranger for long. Dillon guided the wagon down Main Street, nodding greetings to several townspeople who called out to him. Ruby noted how respectfully they addressed him, confirming the station master's assessment of the Forrester family's standing in the community. They turned onto a side street and pulled up before a 2-story house with a wide porch and a sign reading Holloway Boarding House. "Here we are," Dillon announced, setting the brake and jumping down. He came around to Ruby's side and offered his hand. Mrs. Holloway runs the cleanest establishment in town. She's strict but fair, and no one would dare cause trouble under her roof." Ruby placed her hand in his, surprised at how small hers looked against his calloused palm. He helped her down with gentle strength, his hands briefly spanning her waist as he lifted her to the ground. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester," she said, stepping back quickly. "You've been exceedingly kind to a stranger." "We were all strangers once, Miss Calloway," he replied. "Besides, Humboldt may be rough around the edges, but we look after our own here." As he spoke, the front door opened and a plump woman in her 50s emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dillon Forrester, is that you bringing a young lady to my door at supper time?" Her tone was scolding, but her eyes twinkled with good humor. "Mrs. Holloway," Dillon called, tipping his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Ruby Calloway from Boston. She's arrived to find her cousin gone, and she needs lodging." Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes assessed Ruby quickly, taking in her travel-worn but quality clothing, her carpet-bag, and her uncertain expression. "Come in, child," she said, her voice softening. "You look about done in. Dillon, bring the lady's trunk to the blue room upstairs. Then you'll stay for supper, no arguments. I've made chicken and dumplings." Dillon looked as if he might protest, then nodded. "Yes, madam." Ruby followed Mrs. Holloway into a warm foyer that smelled of baking bread and lavender polish. The boarding house was simply but tastefully furnished, speaking to its proprietress's attention to detail. "Now then," Mrs. Holloway said, turning to Ruby. "Single women in my house pay $4 weekly, which includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers in private rooms, though you may receive them in the parlor until 8 in the evening. Laundry is done on Mondays. Church attendance is encouraged but not required." "That sounds very reasonable," Ruby replied, relieved that the terms were within her means at least for a while. "Good. You'll find we're not as formal as Boston folk, but we do maintain standards." Mrs. Holloway's gaze softened. "Dillon mentioned your cousin left town." "Yes, Elizabeth Wilson. I came to help with her dressmaking business." "Lizzie Wilson." "Well, she certainly left in a hurry when that miner proposed. Hardly gave notice." Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "She did leave some sewing things behind, said to sell them, but I never got around to it. They're in the storage room if you're interested." Ruby's heart leaped. "I would be very interested, Mrs. Holloway. I'm a dressmaker by trade." "Are you now?" The older woman looked pleased. "Well, that's providential. I was just telling the Ladies' Aid Society that we desperately need someone with skill. My arthritis doesn't allow for fine stitching anymore." Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Dillon's return. He descended, hat in hand. "Trunks all settled, Mrs. Holloway." "Thank you, Dillon. Now come through to the dining room. Supper's nearly ready, and Miss Calloway can tell us about Boston while we eat," as they followed Mrs. Holloway toward the back of the house. Dillon leaned slightly toward Ruby. "Told you it would work out," he murmured, his breath warm near her ear. Ruby glanced up at him, struck by the genuine pleasure in his eyes at her good fortune. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for everything." His smile in response made something flutter in her chest, a feeling she quickly attributed to hunger and exhaustion. After all, handsome cowboys didn't fall for full-figured dressmakers from Boston. This was the Wild West, not a fairy tale. Yet as they sat down to supper in Mrs. Holloway's dining room, with Dillon's steady presence across the table and the promise of a fresh start ahead of her, Ruby allowed herself to hope that perhaps Humboldt, Nevada might become the home she'd been searching for. The next morning, Ruby awoke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains and the distant sound of a rooster crowing. For a moment, disorientation seized her. The unfamiliar bed, the view of mountains rather than neighboring brownstones before yesterday's events rushed back. She was in Humboldt, Nevada, a place she'd never intended to call home, yet here she was. After dressing in one of her simpler day dresses, Ruby made her way downstairs, following the aroma of fresh coffee and baking biscuits. Mrs. Holloway was bustling about the kitchen, directing a young girl who appeared to be helping with breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Calloway," Mrs. Holloway greeted. "This is Jenny, who helps me 3 mornings a week. Jenny, this is our new boarder, Miss Calloway from Boston." The girl, who couldn't be more than 15, bobbed a quick curtsy. "Morning, miss. Please call me Ruby," she responded with a warm smile. "Is there anything I can help with?" Mrs. Holloway waved her toward the table. "Not on your first morning. Sit and eat. We can talk about your dressmaking plans over breakfast." Ruby obediently took a seat, accepting a cup of coffee with gratitude. As she sipped, Mrs. Holloway brought over a plate laden with biscuits, eggs, and bacon. "Now," the older woman said, sitting across from her, "I've been thinking. The small room off the side parlor would make an excellent space for a dress shop. It has good light and a separate entrance from the street. I've not been using it for anything but storage since my husband passed." Ruby's heart quickened. "You'd be willing to rent it to me? Better than that. I propose we enter into an arrangement. You use the space rent-free for 3 months. In exchange, you make me 2 new dresses and alter some of my existing ones. After 3 months, if your business is thriving, we can discuss a modest rent." Ruby stared at the woman, amazed at such generosity. "Mrs. Holloway, that's incredibly kind, but why would you do this for me? You hardly know me." Mrs. Holloway's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "I've been in this town 30 years, child. I've developed a sense about people. You have honest eyes. Besides," she added pragmatically, "this town needs a dressmaker and I need some new dresses. It's simple business sense." "I don't know what to say," Ruby admitted. "Say yes and then finish your breakfast. After, I'll show you Elizabeth sewing things and the shop space." "Yes, thank you. I won't disappoint you," Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "Good. Also, Dillon Forrester left something for you this morning. It's on the side table in the foyer." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He did?" Mrs. Holloway affirmed, a knowing look in her eyes. "That boy was here at first light. Said he had ranch business in town, but I've known Dillon since he was in short pants. Ranch business doesn't usually bring a man to town before sunrise." Not knowing how to respond, Ruby focused on her breakfast, though her appetite had suddenly diminished in favor of curiosity. When she finished, she made her way to the foyer, where she found a small wooden crate. Attached was a note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Miss Calloway, these are fabric samples from my latest supply run to Carson City. If you find any suitable for your work, I'd be happy to order more on my next trip. Mrs. Peterson always said Carson City had the best selection this side of San Francisco. Welcome to Humboldt. Respectfully, Dillon Forrester." Ruby opened the crate to find neatly cut swatches of fabric's fine wools, sturdy cotton twills, even a few pieces of silk and velvet. Each was of excellent quality, far better than she'd expected to find in Nevada territory. She ran her fingers over a particularly fine piece of emerald green wool, imagining it as a winter walking dress. "That man," Mrs. Holloway said from behind her, "has never shown the slightest interest in fabric before in his life." Ruby turned, clutching the samples. "I'm sure he's just being neighborly." "Neighborly," Mrs. Holloway echoed with a raised eyebrow. "Is that what they call it these days? Come along now, let me show you your shop." The shop exceeded Ruby's expectations. Though small, it featured large windows that flooded the space with natural light, built-in shelves along one wall, and enough room for a cutting table and a couple of chairs for customers. A door connected it to the boarding house's side parlor, while another opened directly onto a small porch and the street. In the storage room behind the kitchen, they found Elizabeth's abandoned sewing supplies, a quality Singer sewing machine, several pairs of shears, boxes of threads, needles, and other notions, and even dress forms in different sizes. Elizabeth wrote that I should sell these and send her the money, Mrs. Holloway explained, but I think she'd approve of them going to her cousin instead. You can pay her back once you're established if your conscience requires it. By midday, Ruby had cleaned the shop space, arranged the sewing machine near the window, and set up the dress forms. Mrs. Holloway helped her hang a temporary sign in the window. R. Calloway, dressmaker, opening soon. Ruby was sorting through a box of patterns when the shop street door opened, admitting a well-dressed woman of about 30, accompanied by a teenage girl who shared her fair coloring. Mrs. Holloway mentioned a dressmaker had arrived, the woman said by way of greeting. I'm Margaret Whitley, the banker's wife. This is my daughter, Sarah. Ruby stood, smoothing her skirts. Ruby Calloway. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitley, Miss Whitley. I'm just getting established, but I hope to open properly next week. Margaret Whitley's eyes assessed Ruby thoroughly, from her practical hairstyle to her modest dress. You're from the East, I understand. Boston. Yes, madam. I trained with Madame Lefevre on Beacon Hill. The name had the desired effect. Mrs. Whitley's eyebrows rose appreciatively. Indeed. Madame Lefevre's reputation extends even to Nevada. My daughter needs a new dress for the Founders' Day dance next month, something appropriate for a girl of 16 but special. The girl, Sarah, stepped forward eagerly. Could it have lace, Miss Calloway, and perhaps a blue sash? Blue is my favorite color. Ruby smiled at her enthusiasm. I think that could be arranged, Miss Whitley. Would you like to look at some designs? For the next hour, Ruby showed the Whitleys several fashion plates she'd brought from Boston, discussing fabrics, styles, and appropriate embellishments for a young lady's dance dress. By the time they left, she had secured her first commission in Humboldt and the promise that Mrs. Whitley would recommend her to her friends. As Ruby closed the door behind them, she leaned against it, a mixture of relief and exhilaration coursing through her. 24 hours ago, she'd been a desperate woman alone at a train station. Now she had lodging, a workshop, supplies, and her first customer. How did it go? Mrs. Holloway asked, appearing in the connecting doorway. Wonderfully, Ruby replied, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Mrs. Whitley has commissioned a dress for her daughter and promised to tell her friends. Margaret Whitley is the most influential woman in town, Mrs. Holloway said approvingly. If she's pleased with your work, you'll have more business than you can handle. The rest of the day passed in a blur of organization and preparation. By evening, Ruby had inventoried her supplies, cleaned the dress forms, and sketched several designs for Sarah Whitley's approval. She was so absorbed in her work that she startled when Mrs. Holloway called her for supper. As she joined the other boarders, an elderly schoolteacher, a young clerk from the mercantile, and a widow who worked at the post office, Ruby felt a sense of community beginning to form. They asked about her journey and her plans, offering advice about Humboldt and its residents without the judgment she'd often felt in Boston society. After the meal, Ruby excused herself to return to her sketches. She was working by lamplight when a knock came at the shop street door. Curious, she crossed the room and opened it to find Dillon Forrester standing on the small porch, hat in hand. Mr. Forrester, she said, surprised. Good evening. Miss Calloway, he replied, his voice carrying through the cool night air. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I saw the light and thought you might still be awake. I've been sketching designs, she explained, suddenly conscious of the pencil smudges that likely adorned her hands and face. "Thank you for the fabric samples. They're lovely." "May I come in for a moment?" he asked. "I have some information that might interest you." Ruby hesitated, aware of Mrs. Holloway's rule about male callers, then decided that a business discussion in her shop was likely acceptable. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. Dillon ducked his head slightly to pass through the doorway, his presence immediately making the small room seem even smaller. He glanced around approvingly at her day's work. "You've accomplished a lot already," he observed. "There's still much to do," Ruby replied, moving to stand behind her cutting table, feeling more professional with the barrier between them. "You said you had information." "Yes." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I made some inquiries at the Mercantile. This is a list of the families in the area who might be interested in your services, along with notes about their circumstances, those with daughters of marriageable age, those who regularly order from catalogs, that sort of thing." Ruby accepted the list, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "This is incredibly helpful, Mr. Forrester. Thank you. I also spoke with my father about your situation," he continued. "Our ranch hands' quarters include a small cabin that's currently empty. If you'd prefer your own space rather than boarding, it could be yours for a modest rent." The offer took Ruby by surprise. "That's very kind, but I'm quite comfortable at Mrs. Holloway's. Besides, I think living above my shop will be convenient." Dillon nodded, seeming neither disappointed nor relieved by her response. "Of course, it was just a thought." He paused, his blue eyes studying her face. "I heard the Whitleys visited today. Sarah's been talking about a new dress for weeks." Ruby smiled. "Yes, she's a sweet girl, very excited about the Founders' Day dance. It's the biggest social event of the year in Humboldt," Dillon explained. "There's a dinner, dancing, awards for the best crops and livestock. Everyone attends." "It sounds lovely," Ruby replied politely, though the thought of attending a dance alone in a town where she knew almost no one was rather intimidating. Dillon shifted his weight, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "Miss Calloway, I wonder if you might consider—" Whatever he'd been about to ask was interrupted by Mrs. Holloway's voice calling from the connecting doorway. "Ruby, is everything all right? I heard voices." Dillon stepped back as the landlady entered the shop, her sharp eyes taking in the situation immediately. "Dillon Forrester, it's nearly 9 o'clock, she scolded mildly. "What business could possibly bring you to call on a lady at this hour?" "Just delivering some information about potential customers, Mrs. Holloway," he replied, his expression appropriately contrite. "I was just leaving." "See that you do," she replied, though there was no real censure in her tone. "A gentleman doesn't risk a lady's reputation, no matter how innocent his intentions." "Yes, madam," Dillon agreed, turning back to Ruby. "Good night, Miss Calloway. I hope the list proves useful." "Thank you again," Ruby said, oddly disappointed by the interruption. "Good night, Mr. Forrester." After he'd gone, Mrs. Holloway gave Ruby a look that managed to be both stern and understanding. "Dillon is a good man, Ruby, one of the finest in the territory, but you're new in town and people will talk. Be careful with your reputation." "Of course," Ruby assured her. It was purely a business discussion. Mrs. Holloway's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just remember, in a small town like Humboldt, everything you do is noticed. Now get some rest. Tomorrow will be another busy day." As Ruby prepared for bed that night, she found herself wondering what Dillon had been about to ask her before Mrs. Holloway's interruption. Had it been related to business, or something more personal? And why did the question leave her feeling both anxious and hopeful? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the practical matters at hand. She was in Humboldt to build a new life and a successful business, not to entertain romantic notions about a cowboy she just met, no matter how kind his eyes or how gentle his manner. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Dillon Forrester's face that filled her dreams, and the memory of his steady hands helping her down from the wagon that followed her into slumber. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Ruby established her dressmaking business. Word spread quickly through Humboldt about the skilled Boston dressmaker, and her small shop soon became a regular stop for the town's women. Sarah Whitley's dance dress was taking shape, a confection of pale blue silk with delicate lace trim that had the teenager visiting daily to check on its progress. Ruby found herself welcomed into the community with unexpected warmth. The mercantile owner, Mr. Peterson, extended her credit for supplies. The banker, Mr. Whitley, helped her establish a business account. Even the gruff sheriff tipped his hat respectfully when she passed him on the street. Most surprising was the steady stream of small kindnesses from Dillon Forrester. He brought her a sturdy wooden display stand for the shop window, claiming he'd had it just lying around at the ranch. When she mentioned needing better lighting for evening work, a beautiful brass oil lamp appeared on her doorstep the next morning. Once, after she'd been caught in a sudden downpour while delivering a finished dress, he happened to be riding by and insisted on escorting her back to the boarding house under the shelter of his duster. On a crisp Saturday morning in late September, Ruby was adjusting the display in her shop window when she heard the now familiar sound of Dillon's wagon approaching. She glanced up to see him pulling to a stop outside, the wagon bed loaded with supplies from the mercantile. "Good morning, Miss Calloway," he called, tipping his hat. "Fine day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Forrester," she replied, stepping onto the porch. Over the past weeks, they'd maintained a formal politeness in their addresses, though Ruby increasingly felt it was a thin veneer over a growing familiarity. Dillon jumped down from the wagon and approached, carrying a small wooden box. "I've brought something for you from Carson City. Came in on yesterday's stage." Ruby accepted the box with curiosity. "What is it?" "Open it and see," he suggested, a boyish eagerness lighting his features. Inside, Ruby found a collection of sewing notions she'd mentioned were difficult to find in Humboldt, fine silk threads in unusual colors, delicate pearl buttons, and several packets of needles specifically designed for work on heavy fabrics. "Mr. Forrester, this is too much," she protested, though her fingers already itched to use the beautiful threads. "Not at all," he assured her. "Consider it a business investment. The better equipped you are, the more customers you'll satisfy and the more prosperous our town becomes." She smiled at his reasoning. "Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse? Thank you." He nodded, seeming pleased by her acceptance. "I also came to ask if you've given any thought to attending the Founders' Day celebration next weekend. The whole town will be there." "I've been so busy with preparations for it that I've hardly had time to consider attending myself," Ruby admitted. "Mrs. Whitley's daughter isn't the only one who needed a new dress. I've been working day and night. But surely you're planning to go?" There was genuine concern in his voice. "It's the best opportunity to meet everyone in the area." Ruby hesitated. The truth was, she'd been avoiding thinking about the dance. In Boston, such events had often been exercises in humiliation, with her standing along the wall while slimmer girls were asked to dance. Even here in Humboldt, where people seemed less judgmental about her figure, the prospect of attending alone was daunting. "I'm not certain," she hedged. "I still have so much work to complete." Dillon studied her face, seeming to read beyond her words. "Miss Calloway Ruby," he said, his voice softening as he used her given name for the first time. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the Founders' Day celebration? Ruby stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want to escort me? Very much, he confirmed, his blue eyes serious. I've been trying to find the courage to ask you for days. But why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Dillon's brow furrowed in confusion. Why wouldn't I? You're intelligent, talented, and the most interesting person to arrive in Humboldt in years. He paused, a slight flush coloring his tan cheeks. Not to mention beautiful. Ruby felt heat rise to her own face. No man had ever called her beautiful before. Pretty perhaps, or possessed of a nice face, but never beautiful. Certainly not with the sincerity she heard in Dillon's voice. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes, he suggested, his eyes hopeful. Let me show you what Humboldt has to offer beyond your shop and Mrs. Holloway's dining table. Ruby found herself smiling despite her nervousness. Yes, then, I would be honored to accompany you, Mr. Forrester. Dillon, he corrected gently. If we're to attend the dance together, I think we can dispense with such formality, don't you? Dillon, she echoed, liking the way his name felt on her lips. Then you must call me Ruby. Ruby, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. It suits you. Before Ruby could respond, Mrs. Holloway's voice called from the boarding house doorway. Ruby, Mrs. Jenkins is here for her fitting. I should go, Ruby said, reluctant to end their conversation. Thank you again for the notions, and for the invitation, Dillon nodded, stepping back. I'll call for you at 6 next Saturday if that's agreeable. That would be perfect, she replied, clutching the box of sewing supplies to her chest as she returned to the shop. Throughout her fitting with Mrs. Jenkins, a rancher's wife who needed her wedding dress, altered for her 20th anniversary celebration, Ruby found her mind returning to Dillon's invitation and the warmth in his eyes when he'd called her beautiful. It seemed impossible that a man like him, handsome, respected, from one of the territory's established families, would be interested in a newcomer like her, especially one whose figure had always been considered a liability rather than an asset. Yet there had been no mistaking the sincerity in his voice or the admiration in his gaze. For the first time in her life, Ruby found herself eagerly anticipating a social gathering, not dreading it. That evening, after closing the shop, Ruby stood before the small mirror in her room, assessing her reflection with new eyes. Her chestnut hair was arranged simply but neatly, her hazel eyes bright, her cheeks naturally rosy without the need for cosmetics. Her figure was full, generously curved at bosom and hip, but her waist was defined, her posture excellent. In Boston, she'd been taught to disguise her curves, to wear dark colors and avoid drawing attention to her silhouette. But here in Nevada, perhaps it was time for a different approach. Impulsively, she pulled a length of deep burgundy silk from her fabric chest, a luxury she'd brought from Boston, intending to save it for a special client. Perhaps, she murmured to her reflection, it's time to be my own best client. With newfound determination, Ruby began sketching a design for a dress that would celebrate rather than conceal her curves, a dress worthy of a woman who had traveled across the continent to build a new life. A dress for a woman who had been called beautiful by a man whose opinion she was beginning to value above all others. The Founders' Day celebration dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Ruby spent the morning completing her final deliveries, including Sarah Whitley's blue silk dress, which was received with squeals of delight and effusive thanks from both daughter and mother. By early afternoon, she had closed the shop and retreated to her room to prepare for the evening. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on heating extra water for a proper bath, sensing the importance of the occasion. It's not every day a girl attends her first Humboldt social on the arm of Dillon Forrester, the landlady remarked as she helped Ruby carry the steaming water upstairs. Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him over the years. Surely you exaggerate, Ruby protested, though the idea that Dillon was widely admired as a matrimonial prospect came as no surprise. Not in the slightest, Mrs. Holloway assured her. That young man could have had his pick of brides since he was 20, but he's always been particular, said he was waiting for the right woman to come along. She gave Ruby a meaningful look before departing to allow her to bathe in privacy. As Ruby soaked in the warm water, scented with a few precious drops of rose oil she'd brought from Boston, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Dillon's interest in her might be more than passing. They'd seen each other nearly every day over the past weeks, their conversations growing longer and more personal with each encounter. He'd spoken of his ranch, his dreams for expanding it, even his mother's death from fever when he was 16. In turn, she'd shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her passion for creating beautiful garments, and the financial troubles that had followed her father's death. There was an ease between them that Ruby had never experienced with a man before, an understanding that transcended words. When she spoke, Dillon listened as if her thoughts were valuable. When he offered an opinion, it was never with condescension but with respect for her intelligence. After her bath, Ruby dried herself and began the process of dressing. She'd completed her new gown just the previous night, working by lamplight until the final stitch was placed. Now, as she slipped it over her head, she felt a thrill of satisfaction. The deep burgundy silk complemented her complexion and hair, while the cut, more fashionable than anything seen in Humboldt before, accentuated her hourglass figure without being immodest. The bodice featured a modest square neckline trimmed with delicate black lace, while the sleeves ended just below her elbows in matching lace cuffs. The skirt was fuller than current Eastern fashion dictated, but Ruby had made the practical adjustment for dancing in a frontier town hall. A black silk sash emphasized her waist, tied in an elegant bow at the back. She arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style, with soft curls framing her face, and the rest swept up into a chignon secured with tortoiseshell combs, another treasured possession from her former life. A pair of small pearl earrings, her mother's, completed the ensemble. When the clock downstairs chimed 5:30, Ruby took a final look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her seemed different from the uncertain traveler who had stepped off the train in Humboldt just weeks ago. There was confidence in her posture, purpose in her expression, and a glow of anticipation in her eyes. At precisely 6 o'clock, Mrs. Holloway's voice called up the stairs. "Ruby, Mr. Forrester is here." Taking a deep breath, Ruby gathered her shawl and reticule and made her way downstairs. As she descended, she saw Dillon standing in the foyer, dressed in what was clearly his finest attire: dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a well-tailored black coat. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his usual stubble to a clean-shaven smoothness that emphasized the strong line of his jaw. When he looked up and saw her on the stairs, his expression transformed from polite waiting to undisguised admiration. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. "Good evening, Dillon," Ruby said, breaking the silence as she reached the bottom step. "Ruby," he replied, his voice slightly hoarse, "you look extraordinary." The sincerity in his tone sent warmth flooding through her. "Thank you, you're quite handsome yourself, Mrs." Holloway cleared her throat meaningfully. "You two should be on your way. The celebration begins at 6:30, and the Whitley girl is performing a piano piece early in the program." Dillon nodded, seeming to collect himself. "Yes, of course." He offered his arm to Ruby. Shall we?" Ruby placed her hand on his sleeve, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath the fine wool of his coat. As they stepped outside, she saw not the usual wagon but a polished buggy with gleaming brass fittings, pulled by a handsome bay horse. "This is Father's courting buggy," Dillon explained as he helped her up. "He insisted I use it tonight, said a lady deserves better than a farm wagon for her first dance in Humboldt." "It's lovely," Ruby replied, touched by the gesture. "Please thank him for me." The ride to the town hall was brief but pleasant, with Dillon pointing out various landmarks and sharing anecdotes about past Founders' Day celebrations. As they approached the building, Ruby could see it was festively decorated with paper lanterns and bunting. Wagons and buggies lined the street, and well-dressed townsfolk were streaming through the doors. "Nervous?" Dillon asked quietly as he helped her down from the buggy. Ruby considered the question. In Boston, she would have been terrified to enter such a gathering, knowing the critical eyes that would assess her figure and find it wanting. But here, with Dillon's steady presence beside her and the confidence of knowing her dress was the finest in the territory, she felt a surprising calm. "Not particularly," she admitted, "though I hope I remember how to dance. It's been some time since I attended a ball." Dillon smiled, offering his arm once more. "Don't worry, our country dances are simpler than what you're used to, I expect. Besides," he added with a wink, "I'm told I'm quite a good partner. I won't let you falter." As they entered the town hall, Ruby was struck by the transformation of the usually austere space. Lanterns cast a warm glow over tables adorned with autumn flowers and ribbons. At one end, a platform had been erected for the musicians, local men with fiddles, a guitar, and a small piano. The opposite end featured long tables laden with food brought by the townsfolk, roasted meats, pies, breads, and preserves of every description. The moment they crossed the threshold, heads turned. Ruby felt the familiar discomfort of being the center of attention, but it dissipated as she realized the looks were not judgmental but admiring. Several women approached immediately, complimenting her dress and expressing delight that she had joined the celebration. Mayor Whitley, a portly man with impressive whiskers, formally welcomed them and insisted on introducing Ruby to several prominent citizens she hadn't yet met. Throughout it all, Dillon remained at her side, his hand occasionally resting lightly at the small of her back, a subtle but clear statement of his regard. When Sarah Whitley took her place at the piano, the crowd quieted. The girl performed admirably, her fingers moving confidently over the keys as she played a Chopin nocturne. Ruby noticed with satisfaction how the blue silk dress complemented the girl's fair coloring, and how confidently she carried herself in her new finery. After the musical performances and the mayor's speech recounting the town's founding, the dancing began. The first was a Virginia reel, lively and informal. Dillon led Ruby onto the floor with quiet confidence. "Just follow my lead," he murmured as the music started. To Ruby's delight, she found the dance came naturally to her. Dillon was indeed an excellent partner, guiding her through the steps with a firm but gentle hand. As they moved through the patterns, changing partners briefly before returning to each other, Ruby felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. They danced 3 more sets before taking a break for refreshments. Dillon brought her a cup of punch and a plate with small portions of the various dishes. "You're a wonderful dancer," he said as they found seats at one of the small tables. "Much better than you claimed." Ruby smiled, flushed from exertion and pleasure. "It's easy with the right partner." As they ate, more townspeople stopped to chat, welcoming Ruby and thanking her for her contributions to the community. Several women made appointments to visit her shop, impressed by both her own dress and Sarah Whitley's creation. "You've made quite an impression," Dillon observed after a particularly effusive compliment from the doctor's wife. "So it seems," Ruby agreed, still slightly amazed by the warm reception. "Everyone has been so kind." "Humboldt values people who contribute," Dillon explained. "You've filled a need in the community, and you've done it with grace and skill. That matters more here than where you came from or—" He hesitated, then continued carefully, "or what you look like." Ruby glanced at him sharply, wondering if he was referring to her figure. But there was no mockery in his expression, only a simple statement of fact. "That's refreshing," she admitted. "In Boston, appearances often matter more than substance." "Their loss is our gain," Dillon replied simply. He hesitated, then added, "There's something I'd like to show you if you're willing to step outside for a moment." Curious, Ruby nodded. Dillon offered his hand, helping her to her feet, and led her toward a side door that opened onto a small garden behind the town hall. The night air was cool after the warmth of the dance floor, and Ruby drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders. The garden was illuminated only by moonlight and the distant glow from the hall's windows. The sounds of music and laughter were muted here, creating a pocket of privacy in the midst of the celebration. Dillon guided her to a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows across the ground. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking up at the stars that seemed so much brighter and more numerous in Nevada than they had ever appeared in Boston. "I wanted a chance to speak with you privately," Dillon said at last, his voice low and earnest. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Ruby turned to face him, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Yes." Dillon took a deep breath, his hands clasped between his knees. "That day at the train station, when I first saw you standing there alone, it wasn't a coincidence that I offered to help." Ruby frowned slightly, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "I was there to meet the train," he explained. "I'd gone to pick up some supplies that were being shipped from Carson City, but when I saw you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "When I saw you, something told me I needed to speak to you, to make sure you were all right." "I'm glad you did," Ruby said softly. "I don't know what I would have done otherwise." "No, you don't understand," Dillon continued, his blue eyes intent in the moonlight. "It wasn't just about helping a stranger. The moment I saw you standing there so brave despite being clearly alone and worried, I felt something I've never felt before." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between his own. "Ruby, I believe I started falling in love with you that very first day." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. "Dillon, I know it sounds impossible," he pressed on. "Love at first sight is the stuff of dime novels, not real life. But these past weeks have only confirmed what I felt that day. Your kindness, your determination, your talent, everything about you draws me closer." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm not asking for anything right now except the chance to continue courting you properly, to show you that what I feel is real and lasting." Ruby felt tears prickling behind her eyes, overwhelmed by his declaration. In Boston, men had pursued her friends for their dowries or family connections, offering practiced compliments that never reached their eyes. Dillon's sincerity was as unmistakable as it was unfamiliar. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, echoing her words from when he'd first asked her to the dance. A smile tugged at his lips. "You could say you'll allow me to call on you, that you'll consider the possibility that what's growing between us might be worth nurturing." Ruby looked down at their joined hands, his tanned and calloused from ranch work, hers pale with the tiny marks of a lifetime of needlework, different yet somehow perfectly matched. "Yes," she said simply, raising her eyes to meet his. "I would like that very much." The joy that transformed his features made her heart skip. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Dillon leaned forward. Ruby met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. His hand came up to cup her cheek, the touch reverent as if she were something precious. When they parted, Ruby felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. The woman who had stepped off the train in Humboldt alone, uncertain, carrying the weight of Boston's judgments, was fading away, replaced by someone new. Someone who could be loved for exactly who she was. "We should return to the dance," Dillon said reluctantly. "People will wonder where we've gone." Ruby nodded, though part of her wished they could remain in this moment, separate from the world. As they rose from the bench, Dillon kept her hand in his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "Ruby," he said softly, "thank you for coming to Humboldt. For being brave enough to start over, for allowing me into your life." "Thank you for being at the station that day," she replied, "for offering your arm when I needed it most." Together they walked back toward the light and music of the town hall, their steps matched and unhurried. As they re-entered the building, several knowing glances were exchanged among the townsfolk, but Ruby found she didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she was proud to be seen, to be known, to be chosen by a man who saw her true worth. The weeks following the Founders' Day celebration brought a flurry of changes to Ruby's life. Her dressmaking business flourished, with orders coming not only from Humboldt but from neighboring settlements as well. Mrs. Calloway, seeing the potential for expansion, offered Ruby a formal lease on the shop space at a reasonable rate, which she gladly accepted. Even more significant was the evolution of her relationship with Dillon. True to his word, he began courting her, properly calling at the boarding house 3 evenings a week, escorting her to church on Sundays, and finding reasons to visit her shop during the day. Each time they met, Ruby discovered something new to admire about him: his dedication to his family's ranch, his quiet intelligence, his dry humor that could make her laugh even on her most stressful days. As October gave way to November, Ruby found herself invited to Sunday dinner at the Double F Ranch. Though excited to see Dillon's home and meet his family, she was undeniably nervous. "What if his father doesn't approve of me?" she fretted to Mrs. Calloway as she prepared for the visit. The landlady snorted dismissively. "Frederick Forrester is the most practical man in the territory. He'll see what his son sees: a hardworking, talented woman who would be an asset to any family." Despite these reassurances, Ruby took special care with her appearance, selecting a forest green day dress that she'd recently completed for herself. The color complemented her chestnut hair, and the style, while modest, highlighted her best features. Dillon arrived precisely at noon, driving the polished buggy he'd used for the dance. He whistled appreciatively when Ruby descended the boarding house steps. "You look beautiful," he said, helping her into the buggy. "Father and Daniel are looking forward to meeting you properly." The journey to the Double F took nearly an hour, giving Ruby time to appreciate the landscape of her new home. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, while the rolling grasslands were dotted with cattle bearing the Forrester brand. As they approached the ranch, Ruby was impressed by its size and evident prosperity. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and various sheds formed a neat compound around a central yard. Everything spoke of careful planning and diligent maintenance. "It's magnificent," Ruby said sincerely as Dillon helped her down from the buggy. "It's home," he replied with quiet pride. "My grandfather built the original cabin in 1835. Father expanded it when he married my mother. Someday." He trailed off, but his glance at Ruby held a question she wasn't quite ready to answer. Before she could respond, the front door opened, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped onto the porch. Frederick Forrester bore a striking resemblance to his son, though his face was more weathered, his frame leaner. Behind him stood a younger man who could only be Daniel, Dillon's brother, similar in coloring but slighter in build, with spectacles perched on his nose. "Welcome to the Double F, Miss Calloway," Frederick called, his voice deep and resonant like his son's. "We've heard a great deal about you." "All good, I hope," Ruby replied as she and Dillon climbed the porch steps. The elder Forrester's eyes crinkled with amusement. "My son seems incapable of speaking about you in any terms other than glowing ones." He extended his hand. "Frederick Forrester, please call me Fred." Ruby shook his hand, pleased by his straightforward manner. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Fred. Your ranch is impressive." "3 generations of Forrester sweat built it," he replied with understated pride. He gestured to the younger man. "This is my younger son, Daniel." Daniel stepped forward, offering a shy smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Calloway. Dillon hasn't exaggerated your beauty." Ruby felt herself blush as Dillon groaned good-naturedly. "Leave off, Danny. You'll embarrass her." "Come inside," Fred said, leading the way into the house. "Rosa has prepared quite a feast." The interior of the Forrester home surprised Ruby with its refinement. Though rustic in construction, it was furnished with pieces that spoke of quality and taste: a solid oak dining table that could seat 12, comfortable leather chairs in the parlor, and shelves lined with books that showed evidence of frequent use. Most striking were the fine curtains at the windows, and the hand-stitched quilts adorning the backs of chairs, clear indications of a woman's touch, despite Mrs. Forrester's long absence. Rosa, the Forresters' housekeeper, a middle-aged Mexican woman who had worked for the family since Dillon was a boy, had indeed prepared a magnificent meal. The table was laden with roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch's kitchen garden. Throughout dinner, Ruby found herself drawn into easy conversation with the Forrester men. Fred asked thoughtful questions about her business and offered insights into the needs of the ranching families in the area. Daniel, who managed the ranch's books and correspondence, shared his love of literature, delighted to find that Ruby was also an avid reader. After the meal, while Rosa cleared the table, Fred suggested that Dillon show Ruby the rest of the ranch. As they walked the property, Dillon's arm supporting her over the rougher ground, Ruby was struck by the harmony of the place, the way the buildings nestled into the landscape, the respectful relationship between the Forresters and their ranch hands, the care taken with every aspect of the operation. "Your father has built something remarkable here," she observed as they paused by the corral, where several horses grazed peacefully in the autumn sunshine. "We've built it together," Dillon corrected gently. "Father, Daniel, and me, each generation adding something." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what I want to add." Ruby's heart quickened at his tone. "Oh," Dillon gestured toward a ridge about a quarter-mile from the main house. "There's a spot up there with a view of the whole valley. I've always thought it would be the perfect place for a home. Not to replace the main house, Daniel will inherit that as the keeper of the family records, but a place of my own." His eyes met hers. A place to raise a family. The implications of his words hung between them, unspoken but clear. Ruby found herself imagining a house on that ridge, windows catching the morning sunlight, children playing in a yard while Dillon taught them to ride. "It sounds lovely," she said softly. Dillon took her hands in his. "Ruby, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I believe we could build a good life together." Ruby's breath caught. Though they'd been courting for weeks, though his attentions had made his feelings clear, hearing the words spoken so plainly sent a rush of emotion through her. Dillon, he pressed a finger gently to her lips. Don't answer yet. I'm not formally proposing, not here, not like this. You deserve better than a hasty question by a horse corral. He smiled, his eyes tender. I just wanted you to know my intentions, to understand that when I look at you, I see my future. Ruby felt tears welling in her eyes. All her life, she'd been made to feel that her worth was diminished by her figure, that she should be grateful for any attention from a respectable man. Now here stood Dillon Forrester, handsome, kind, prosperous, looking at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever beheld. Thank you, she whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek, for seeing me, the real me. Dillon turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. From that first moment at the station, Ruby, I saw you then and I see you now. They stood together in comfortable silence, the autumn breeze carrying the scents of pine and sage around them. In that moment, Ruby knew with certainty that she had found not just a new town or a new business, but a new beginning in every sense. Humboldt, Nevada, a place she'd never heard of months ago, had become home. As winter settled over Humboldt, Ruby's life fell into a pleasant routine. Her days were filled with work in her increasingly successful shop, her evenings often spent in Dillon's company. Their courtship progressed naturally, with Dillon a frequent dinner guest at Mrs. Holloway's and Ruby a regular visitor to the Double F for Sunday meals. In early December, as the first significant snowfall blanketed the town, Dillon arrived at the boarding house one evening with an unusual request. I'd like to take you on a sleigh ride tomorrow, he said as they sat in the parlor, the only other occupant being the elderly schoolteacher dozing by the fire, a perfectly respectable chaperone who conveniently provided them with a measure of privacy. If you can spare an afternoon away from your work. Ruby, who had been teaching him to play chess, looked up from the board with interest. A sleigh ride? I haven't been on one since I was a child in Boston. Daniel and I pulled the old cutter out of storage yesterday, Dillon explained. The snow's perfect for it. I thought you might enjoy seeing some of the countryside from a different perspective. I would love to, Ruby agreed readily. Winter had slowed her business somewhat, as fewer people traveled into town during the colder months. What time shall I be ready? 1 o'clock, Dillon replied, moving his knight with a triumphant smile. Check. Ruby laughed, already plotting her counter-move. Enjoy your small victory, Mr. Forrester. It won't last long. The next day dawned clear and cold, the snow sparkling beneath a brilliant blue sky. Ruby dressed warmly in a navy wool dress with a fur-lined cloak that she'd purchased from a traveling merchant, her first real extravagance since establishing her business. Dillon arrived promptly at 1, driving a handsome cutter sleigh pulled by 2 matching bay horses. Bells jingled merrily from their harnesses as they pranced in the snow, eager to run. This is delightful, Ruby exclaimed as Dillon helped her into the sleigh, tucking thick fur robes around her legs. Wait until you see the view from Ridge Road, he promised, taking his seat beside her and gathering the reins. On a clear day like this, you can see all the way to the Sierras. The horses set off at a brisk trot, their hooves kicking up plumes of snow as the sleigh glided smoothly along Humboldt's Main Street. Several townspeople called greetings as they passed, and Ruby found herself smiling and waving like a queen in a parade. Once beyond the town limits, Dillon gave the horses more freedom. They responded eagerly, stretching into a canter that sent the sleigh flying over the pristine snow. Ruby laughed with exhilaration, her cheeks flushed from the cold and excitement. This is wonderful. She called over the jingling bells and rushing wind. Dillon grinned, his own face alight with pleasure at her enjoyment. "Hold tight," he advised as they approached a gentle slope. "This next part is even better." The horses surged forward, pulling the sleigh up the rise and then over the crest. For a breathless moment, Ruby felt as if they were flying, suspended between earth and sky. Then the runners touched down again with barely a bump, continuing their smooth glide across the winter landscape. They traveled for nearly an hour, Dillon pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the territory where he'd hunted his first deer, the creek where he and Daniel had learned to swim, the distant peaks named by native tribes long before white settlers arrived. Eventually, they turned onto a narrower track that wound upward through a stand of pines. "Where are we going?" Ruby asked, curious about their destination. "Somewhere special," Dillon replied mysteriously. "It's not much farther." The track emerged suddenly onto a wide, flat area at the top of a ridge. Dillon reined the horses to a halt, setting the brake on the sleigh. Before them stretched a panoramic view of the valley Humboldt nestled in its center, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, the silvery ribbon of the river winding through the snow-covered landscape, and beyond, the majestic mountains reaching toward the sky. "Oh, Dillon," Ruby breathed, awestruck by the beauty before her. "It's magnificent." "This is the spot I told you about," he said quietly, "where I've thought of building someday." Ruby gazed around with new interest, seeing now what a perfect home site it would make sheltered from the worst winds by the pines behind them, but with unobstructed views in 3 directions. "I can see why you love it," she said, trying to imagine a house here, a garden, perhaps children playing in the yard. Dillon reached beneath the seat and produced a small basket. "I thought we might have a small picnic. Rosa packed some treats." He lifted the lid to reveal a thermos of hot chocolate, slices of spice cake wrapped in cloth, and 2 enamel mugs. "A winter picnic," Ruby said with delight. "How thoughtful." They shared the simple meal, sipping hot chocolate that warmed them from within while discussing their plans for Christmas, just 2 weeks away. As they talked, Ruby noticed Dillon seemed unusually nervous, his usual confident manner giving way to a certain restlessness. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally. "You seem distracted." Dillon set his empty mug aside, turning to face her more directly. "I am distracted," he admitted. "I brought you here today for a specific reason, Ruby." Her heart began to beat faster as he took her gloved hands in his. "The last few months have been the happiest of my life," he continued, his blue eyes earnest. "Getting to know you, watching you build your business and become part of our community, it's been a joy I never expected when I saw you standing alone at that train station." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I promised I wouldn't propose hastily by a horse corral," he said with a smile that held both humor and nervousness. "So I've brought you to the place where I hope we might build our future together." Ruby felt tears welling in her eyes as Dillon carefully opened the box to reveal a delicate gold band set with a modest but perfectly clear diamond, flanked by 2 small rubies. "Ruby Calloway," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of building a life with me here in Humboldt, of allowing me to love you for all the days we're given?" For a moment, Ruby couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. In her wildest dreams, she had never imagined finding such happiness, such acceptance, such love. The journey that had begun in desperation at a Boston train station had led her here, to this perfect moment on a snow-covered ridge with a man who saw her true worth. "Yes," she managed finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Dillon, with all my heart, yes." Joy transformed his features as he removed her glove and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. Later, she would learn that it had been Dillon had commissioned it from a jeweler in Carson City, providing precise measurements he'd surreptitiously obtained while holding her hand during their evening walks. "I love you, Ruby," he said, drawing her into his arms. From that first day, and for all the days to come. "And I love you," she whispered against his lips before they met in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. The return journey to town seemed to pass in a dream, with Ruby alternately admiring her ring and sneaking glances at her fiancé's profile. Fiancé. The word itself was a marvel, a promise of belonging she'd never truly expected to find. As they approached the boarding house, Ruby noticed several figures on the porch: Mrs. Holloway, Fred and Daniel Forrester, and to her surprise, Reverend Thompson from the church. "Did you tell everyone?" she asked, suddenly understanding Dillon's confidence in her answer. He grinned somewhat sheepishly. "I might have mentioned my intentions. Father insisted on being here to congratulate us immediately if you said yes. And the Reverend, that was Mrs. Holloway's idea. She thought you might appreciate having a small celebration with those closest to us." Ruby's heart swelled with gratitude for these people who had become her family in such a short time. As Dillon helped her from the sleigh, their waiting audience broke into applause and calls of congratulation. Fred Forrester was the first to embrace her, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Welcome to the family, daughter," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You've made my son happier than I've ever seen him." One by one, the others offered their congratulations, Daniel with shy sincerity, Mrs. Holloway with tears in her eyes, Reverend Thompson with a blessing for their future together. As they moved inside to the warmth of the boarding house parlor, where Rosa had prepared a special dinner, Ruby found herself surrounded by more love and acceptance than she had known in all her years in Boston. Later that evening, after the celebrations had ended and the others had departed, Dillon lingered on the boarding house porch for a private moment with his new fiancée. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close against the December chill. "More than I ever thought possible," Ruby replied truthfully. "When I stepped off that train and no one was there to meet me, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. I never imagined that moment would lead to this." Dillon brushed a tendril of hair from her face, his expression thoughtful. "I believe some things are meant to be, Ruby. I was supposed to be at the station that day to receive supplies, but they never arrived. I nearly didn't wait for the train at all." "What made you stay?" she asked, curious. He shook his head slightly, as if puzzled by his own actions. "I don't know. Something told me to wait, to see who stepped off that train. And then there you were, this beautiful, brave woman standing alone with her trunk, looking lost but determined." His arms tightened around her. "I couldn't have walked away if I'd tried." Ruby laid her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I," he murmured into her hair. "So am I." As Christmas approached, Ruby found herself busier than ever. Despite the winter slowdown in regular business, she had a special project occupying her time: her wedding dress. After much discussion, she and Dillon had decided on a New Year's Day wedding, a fitting beginning to 1879 and their life together. The dress was her finest creation, yet ivory silk with delicate lace overlay on the bodice, the sleeves ending just below her elbows in scalloped edges. The skirt was fuller than current Eastern fashion, a concession to the practical needs of a frontier wedding in winter, but the effect was nonetheless elegant and flattering to her figure. 3 days before Christmas, as Ruby was working on the final touches to her dress, Mrs. Holloway entered the shop with an unexpected visitor, a thin, anxious-looking woman clutching a battered carpet bag. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Holloway said, her expression unreadable. "This is Elizabeth Wilson, your cousin." Ruby froze, her needle suspended mid-stitch. The cousin whose absence had changed the course of her life stood before her, looking nothing like the confident, successful woman described in her letters. "Elizabeth," Ruby set aside her work and rose slowly. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in California." The woman twisted her hands nervously. I am, that is, I was until last week." She glanced at Mrs. Holloway, who nodded encouragingly. "My husband. It didn't work out. He wasn't what he seemed." "I'll leave you two to talk," Mrs. Holloway said tactfully, retreating to the main house. An awkward silence fell between the cousins. Finally, Ruby gestured to a chair. "Please sit. Would you like some tea?" Elizabeth nodded gratefully, sinking into the offered seat. As Ruby busied herself with the small stove she kept in the shop for winter warmth, her mind raced. What did Elizabeth's return mean? Did she expect to reclaim her business, her place in the community? The woman's dejected appearance suggested otherwise, but Ruby couldn't help feeling a flutter of anxiety. "I owe you an apology," Elizabeth said, as Ruby handed her a cup of tea. "I should have written when my plans changed. I never meant to leave you stranded." "It was difficult," Ruby acknowledged, taking the chair opposite her cousin. "But as you can see, things worked out rather well in the end." Elizabeth's gaze moved around the shop, noting the quality of Ruby's work, the evidence of a thriving business. "So I see. Mrs. Holloway tells me you're to be married on New Year's Day, to Dillon Forrester, no less." There was no malice in her tone, only weary resignation. "You've accomplished more in a few months than I did in 3 years here." "Elizabeth," Ruby began carefully, "why have you come back to Humboldt?" Her cousin stared into her teacup. "I have nowhere else to go. Thomas, my husband, turned out to be a gambler and a drunk. He lost everything, including our house. When he raised his hand to me, I finally found the courage to leave." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I thought perhaps there might be work here, a fresh start." Ruby studied the woman before her, the cousin she barely knew, whose actions had inadvertently led her to the greatest happiness she'd ever known. Elizabeth looked beaten down by life, but there was still a spark of the determination that had first brought her west. "As it happens," Ruby said slowly, "I've been considering taking on an assistant. The business has grown faster than I anticipated, especially with wedding preparations consuming so much of my time." Hope flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. "You'd consider employing me, after what I did?" "What you did brought me to Humboldt," Ruby replied with a small smile. "To Dillon, to a life I love. It's hard to hold a grudge under those circumstances." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "I don't deserve such kindness." "Perhaps not," Ruby agreed frankly. "But we're family, and families should support each other through difficult times. Besides," she added with practical good humor, "you're a skilled seamstress. It would be foolish of me to turn away qualified help when I need it." By the time Dillon arrived that evening to escort Ruby to dinner at the hotel, a weekly tradition they'd established, the cousins had reached an agreement. Elizabeth would work in the shop, starting with basic alterations and gradually taking on more responsibility as she proved herself reliable. She would board with Mrs. Holloway, paying a reduced rate in exchange for helping with household chores. Dillon, to Ruby's relief, accepted the arrangement with his customary understanding. "If you believe in giving her a second chance, then so do I," he said simply. "Besides, having help in the shop means you'll have more time for other things once we're married." The warmth in his eyes as he spoke made Ruby blush, understanding the implications of his words. Their wedding night was a subject they discussed only in the most circumspect terms, but the anticipation of truly belonging to each other in every way added a sweet tension to their remaining days of courtship. Christmas arrived with a fresh snowfall that transformed Humboldt into a winter wonderland. Ruby spent the morning with Elizabeth and Mrs. Holloway, exchanging modest gifts before attending the special service at church. Afterward, Dillon collected her for Christmas dinner at the Double F, where Fred and Daniel welcomed her as if she were already part of the family. The Forrester home was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, a tradition Dillon's mother had established years ago. A tall spruce tree stood in the parlor, adorned with handmade ornaments and small candles that would be lit after dinner. The scents of roasting goose, cinnamon, and pine filled the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. Before the meal, gifts were exchanged by the fire. Ruby had made each of the Forrester men a new shirt, tailored perfectly to their measurements and embroidered with their initials. For Dillon, she'd also crafted a quilted wall hanging depicting the view from their ridge, a labor of love that had consumed many secret evening hours. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice hushed as he traced the stitching that outlined the mountains. "You've captured it perfectly." In return, the Forresters presented Ruby with a family gift, a cedar hope chest beautifully crafted by a carpenter in Carson City, lined with aromatic wood and fitted with brass hinges and lock. "Every bride needs a place for her treasures," Fred explained as Dillon and Daniel carried it in from the next room. Ruby ran her hand over the polished surface, moved beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift, and all it represented their acceptance of her into their family, their support of her marriage to Dillon, their acknowledgement of the future she and Dillon would build together. "Thank you," she managed finally, embracing each of them in turn. "It's perfect." Dillon's personal gift to her was a delicate gold locket containing a small photograph of the two of them, taken by a traveling photographer who had visited Humboldt the previous month. "So you'll always have me close to your heart," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Christmas dinner was a feast that reminded Ruby of holidays past when her parents were alive, and their home was filled with laughter and love. The Forresters had created that same atmosphere, different in setting and circumstance, but identical in the warmth and affection that permeated the celebration. As darkness fell and the candles on the tree were lit, Ruby found herself seated beside Dillon on a sofa near the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him in comfortable silence. Across the room, Fred and Daniel were engaged in a friendly argument about the best method for breaking a particular colt, their voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of a long-standing family debate. "Happy?" Dillon asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. Ruby looked up at him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man and the life they were creating together. "Perfectly," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. 1 week later, as the first light of 1879 dawned over Humboldt, Ruby stood in her room at the boarding house, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. The wedding dress was even more beautiful than she had imagined, the ivory silk catching the golden morning light, the lace details adding delicate texture to the bodice. Mrs. Holloway had arranged Ruby's hair in an elegant updo, adorned with small white flowers and a simple veil that trailed to her shoulders. Around her neck hung Dillon's locket, and on her finger sparkled his ring, symbols of the promises they would soon formalize before God and their community. "You look radiant, dear," Mrs. Holloway said, straightening the veil one last time, "like a true bride should." A soft knock at the door announced Elizabeth's arrival. In the week since her return, The cousins had begun building a relationship based on shared work and mutual respect rather than distant family ties. Now, Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she beheld Ruby in her wedding finery. "You're beautiful," she said simply. "Dillon Forrester is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Ruby replied, embracing her cousin carefully to avoid crushing her dress. "Thank you for being here today." The small church was filled to capacity when Ruby arrived, escorted by Fred Forrester, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. As they paused at the entrance, Ruby caught her first glimpse of Dillon standing at the altar, his tall figure distinguished in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to pure joy as he saw her. The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and instantaneous. One moment, Ruby was standing at the back of the church. The next, she was placing her hand in Dillon's, looking up into eyes that reflected all the love in her own heart. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thompson began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was traditional and heartfelt. Ruby and Dillon had written their own vows, simple declarations of love and commitment that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. When Dillon placed a simple gold band beside her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and certain as he repeated the ancient promise. "With this ring I thee wed." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson said at last. "Dillon, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief but tender, appropriate for a church setting yet filled with the promise of deeper intimacy to come. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, applause erupted throughout the church. The celebration that followed at the town hall was jubilant, a community coming together to honor not just a marriage but the completion of a story that had begun with a lonely woman at a train station and a cowboy who offered his arm and, ultimately, his heart. There was dancing and feasting, speeches and toasts, laughter and a few sentimental tears. As the festivities wound down in the late afternoon, Ruby and Dillon slipped away to begin their new life together. Rather than spending their wedding night at the boarding house or the main ranch house, Dillon had prepared a surprise, a small but comfortable cabin on their ridge, the first structure of what would eventually become their permanent home. "It's just temporary," he explained as he carried her over the threshold, "but I wanted us to start our marriage here, on the land that will be ours." The cabin consisted of a single room, simply but comfortably furnished with a bed, a table and chairs, a small cook stove, and a rocking chair near the window that offered the spectacular view they both loved. A fire already blazed in the hearth, casting golden light over the rustic interior and banishing the January chill. "It's perfect," Ruby said, turning in a slow circle to take in every detail. "Our first home." As darkness fell over Humboldt, as snow began to drift lazily past the windows of their cabin, Ruby and Dillon Forrester discovered the final dimension of their love for each other, the physical expression of the bond that had formed between them from that first meeting at the train station. Their coming together was tender and passionate, a culmination of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Afterward, as they lay together in the warmth of their marriage bed, Ruby reflected on the extraordinary path that had led her to this happiness. The cousin who never came, the cowboy who offered his arm when she most needed support, the town that welcomed her, the man who saw beyond her appearance to the woman within, all threads woven into the tapestry of her new life. "What are you thinking about?" Dillon asked, his fingers gently tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Ruby smiled in the firelit darkness, turning to face her husband. I was thinking about beginnings, about how the end of one journey can be the start of something far more beautiful than you ever imagined. Dillon drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. This is just our first day, Ruby Forrester. We have a lifetime of beginnings ahead of us. A lifetime, she echoed, savoring the words and all they promised. I like the sound of that. Epilogue: 5 years later. The Double F Ranch had changed significantly in the 5 years since Ruby and Dillon's wedding. The small cabin on the ridge had been replaced by a handsome 2-story home, built with the same care and attention to detail that characterized everything the Forresters created. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, and flower beds brightened the front yard during the warmer months. Inside, the house reflected the blending of Ruby's Eastern refinement with Dillon's Western practicality: comfortable furniture built to last, colorful quilts made by Ruby's hands, bookcases filled with volumes on everything from animal husbandry to Shakespeare. But the most significant changes were the smaller occupants of the home: 4-year-old Frederick James Forrester, named for his grandfather and Ruby's father, and 18-month-old Emma Rose, whose chubby cheeks and chestnut curls were the image of her mother's. On a warm September afternoon, Ruby sat on the front porch, rocking Emma while watching Dillon and young Freddie in the yard below. Father and son were engaged in a serious discussion about the proper way to groom a pony, Freddie's 4th birthday present and current obsession. The sight of them together, Dillon kneeling to meet his son at eye level, his patience evident even from a distance, Freddie nodding solemnly, as he absorbed his father's instructions, filled Ruby's heart with contentment. In Dillon, she had found not just a loving husband but an exceptional father, a man who approached parenthood with the same dedication he brought to every aspect of his life. Emma stirred in her arms, her tiny fingers reaching for the locket that still hung around Ruby's neck. The original photograph inside had been joined by a second, a family portrait taken on Emma's christening day, all 4 Forresters dressed in their Sunday best. "Mama," Emma said, one of her few clear words, accompanied by a smile that revealed 6 perfect teeth. "Yes, my darling," Ruby replied, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Mama's here." From the yard came the sound of Freddie's laughter as Dillon swung him high into the air, the boys' delight echoing across the ridge. The pony, a gentle creature selected specifically for a child's first mount, watched their antics with philosophical equanimity from its nearby pen. Ruby's dressmaking business had evolved along with her family. After her marriage, she had maintained the shop in town, with Elizabeth managing daily operations while Ruby focused on design and specialized garments. The arrangement had proven successful beyond anyone's expectations, allowing Ruby to balance her passion for sewing with the demands and joys of motherhood. Elizabeth, too, had found her place in Humboldt. After 2 years of working alongside Ruby, she had met and married the new schoolteacher, a widower with 2 young daughters who appreciated Elizabeth's practical nature and gentle way with his children. Their blended family had become an integral part of the community, and the cousins who had once been strangers were now as close as sisters. The sound of an approaching wagon drew Ruby's attention. Fred Forrester appeared around the bend in the road, driving at his usual deliberate pace. At 70, he remained active in ranch operations, though he had gradually handed more responsibility to Dillon and Daniel over the years. These days, his greatest joy was his grandchildren teaching Freddie to fish, rocking Emma to sleep with ancient lullabies, telling them stories of the early days on the frontier. "Grandpa," Freddie shouted, abandoning his pony lesson to race toward the wagon. Dillon followed at a more sedate pace, waving to his father. Fred pulled the wagon to a halt, setting the brake before carefully descending. Age had slowed his movements but not dimmed his spirit or the clarity of his mind. He scooped Freddie into his arms with practiced ease, accepting the boy's enthusiastic hug with evident pleasure. "And how's my cowboy today?" he asked, setting the child down but keeping hold of his hand. "Papa's teaching me about ponies," Freddie announced importantly. "I brushed mine all by myself. Did you now? That's fine work for a young man." Fred looked up toward the porch, raising his voice slightly. "And how are my girls this afternoon?" "We're well, Father Forrester," Ruby called back warmly. "Emma's just waking from her nap. Come up and have some lemonade. It's fresh made." As the men and Freddie climbed the porch steps, Ruby reflected on how naturally Fred had included her in his family, how completely she felt a part of the Forrester legacy. Never once had he or Daniel made her feel less than wholly welcomed, wholly loved. "Daniel sends his regrets," Fred said as he settled into a chair, accepting the glass of lemonade Ruby poured for him. "He's caught up with the cattle broker from Carson City, but he'll be up for Sunday dinner as usual." Daniel, still unmarried at 32, had found his place managing the business side of the ranch. His natural aptitude for numbers and negotiations had expanded the double FTKS operations substantially over the past 5 years. Though he lived in the main ranch house with Fred, he was a frequent visitor to Dillon and Ruby's home, a devoted uncle who brought books for Freddie and hair ribbons for Emma. As the afternoon eased toward evening, the family gathered around the table on the porch, sharing a simple meal of cold chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from Ruby's garden. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Freddie's excited accounts of his day's adventures and Emma's occasional babbling contributions. After the meal, as twilight painted the valley in shades of purple and gold, Dillon took Ruby's hand and led her to the edge of the yard. Behind them, Fred was entertaining the children with a story about a clever rabbit, his deep voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Happy?" Dillon asked, echoing the question he had asked so many times over the years of their marriage. Ruby leaned against him, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence just as she had that first day at the train station. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "And you?" Dillon's arm tightened around her waist as he gazed out over the land that had been in his family for 3 generations and would someday belong to their children. "I have everything a man could want," he said simply. "A beautiful wife, healthy children, good land. What more could I ask for?" Ruby turned in his arms to face him, studying the beloved features that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar on his chin from a childhood fall, the steady blue gaze that had never lost its ability to make her heart quicken. "Do you ever think about that day at the station?" she asked. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't been there when my train arrived." Dillon's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes. But then, I remember something my mother used to say, that the important meetings in our lives are never accidents, that God places us where we need to be at exactly the right moment." "I like that thought," Ruby said softly, "that we were meant to find each other." "I know we were," Dillon replied with quiet conviction. "From that first moment when no one came to claim you and I offered my arm, and my heart." He smiled, the tenderness in his eyes making him look momentarily like the younger man who had helped a stranded woman 5 years earlier. "Best decision I ever made." Ruby stood on tiptoe to kiss him, a gesture as natural now as breathing. "For both of us," she whispered against his lips. Behind them, Emma began to fuss, ready for her evening routine. Freddie was pleading with his grandfather for just one more story, please. The practicalities of family life called them back to the porch, to the responsibilities and joys that defined their days. As they turned toward home, toward the children who were their future and the elder who was their link to the past, Ruby Forrester offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place, this life, this love. The train to Humboldt had been meant to be a continuation of her journey, not its destination. But in the moment when she stood alone on that platform, when a kind cowboy offered his assistance, her true journey had begun, one that had led her not just to a new town, but to the home her heart had always sought.